Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi. Today's Daf is Menachot Daf 69 Omid A. Just gonna get something ready. Okay, so let's dive straight in. So just finishing off from the last Omid. In this manner, Rabbi has attempted to prove that the proper order of the Omer offering followed by the two loaves is necessary to perform the new grain for use in meal offering. The Gemara rejects this proof. Do you hold that when we say the two loaves must come from the first fruits, the verse is referring to the new fruit crop grown this year? This is not so. Rather, we say that the two loaves must come from the first fruits sacrificed on the altar this year. Therefore, even in Rabbi's case, the two loaves cannot come from wheat, as the altar has already consumed from the fruit, i.e. the wheat used for the Omer offering of this year. Rami Bahama raises a dilemma. With regard to the two loaves that permit the bringing of first fruit, are all fruit that are budding at the time of the sacrifice permitted, or Moshe comes to explain that Rami Bahama's dilemma refers to the bringing of the first fruits, which is permitted only after the sacrifice of the two loaves on Shavuot. Rashi, Rabbeinu, Gershom, Margola, Shittim, Mechubeses. The Rambam indicates that Rami Bahama is referring to grain, which is permitted to be used in meal offerings only after the two loaves have been sacrificed. According to this interpretation, the question is whether or not the budding or formation of the leaves or on grain stalks is tantamount to the stalk taking root. Rambam says, "Avoda hilchat tamidim misafim 720 are only fruit that has gone through formation permitted. If at the time of the sacrifice of the two loaves on Shavuot the leaves of produce had already budded or formed, it is uncertain whether or not this is tantamount to taking root. Therefore, this produce should not be used in a meal offering. If it was used, the offering is accepted." Rambam says, "Avoda hilchat tamidim misafim 720. The Gemara asks, what is meant here by budding, and what is meant is the meaning of formation? If we say this is referring to the budding of the fruit and the formation of the fruit, this is difficult. Now that is taught in 78 that even in the case of grain taking root prior to the bringing of the two loaves, that grain is permitted by the sacrifice. It is necessary to discuss the budding or formation of fruit, which corresponds to a latter stage than the taking root of grain. The Gemara answers, rather Rami Bahama is referring to the budding of the fruit tree's leaf and formation of a fruit tree's leaf. So what does that mean? I think I said the wrong footnote before. Most early commentators explain that Rami Bahama's dilemma refers to the bringing of the first fruits, which is permitted only after the sacrifice of the two loaves. And Shavuot, Rashi, Rabbeinu, Gershom, Mohagola, Shittim, Mechubeses. The Rambam indicates that Rami Bahama is referring to grain, which is permitted to be used in meal offerings only after the two loaves have been sacrificed. According to this interpretation, the question is whether or not the budding or the formation of the leaves on grain stalks is tantamount to the stalk taking root. Rambam says, "Avoda hilchat tamidim misafim 720. Where was I? The question is whether the budding of the fruit trees is like the taking root of the grain, and therefore all of the tree's first fruit is permitted by the two loaves, or whether this budding is not similar to the taking root of grain, and therefore the tree's fruit is not permitted by the two loaves." The Gemara concludes, this dilemma shall stand on result. Rabba Barav Hanan raises a dilemma with regard to wheat kernels that one sowed in the ground. Does the bringing of the Omer offering permit them to be eaten, or does the Omer not permit them in consumption? The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If this is referring to a case where the wheat kernel has already taken root prior to the bringing of the Omer offering, we already learned this in a Mishnah. If it's referring to a case where the wheat stalk has not yet taken root, we already learned this in a Mishnah as well. The Gemara cites the source for this claim. As we learned in a Mishnah in 78, if crops took root before the sacrifice of the Omer offering, the Omer permits them to be eaten, and if not, i.e. they took root after the sacrifice of the Omer offering, they are prohibited until the next Omer is sacrificed the following year. The Gemara explains, no. Rabba Barav Hanan's dilemma is necessary only in a case where one reaped grain and sowed it. The Chazi Dinhu Uzri Inhu. With regard to grain that had taken root only after the bringing of the Omer offering and was then reaped and replanted, but did not take root prior to the bringing of the next Omer offering, its status is uncertain. The Gemara does not rule whether these wheat grains are considered as though they were cast into a jug and are consequently permitted by the Omer, or whether they are considered as attached to the ground and consequently remain prohibited, as they have been subordinated to the ground and have not yet taken root. Therefore, when one who eats from them is not subject to receive lashes by Torah law, but he is given lashes for rebelliousness, as prescribed for one who violates a rabbinic prohibition. And so the Rambam says, Kedusha Menachot Daf 10:5. Where was I? Prior to the Omer, and the time the Omer arrived and passed. The only commentators provide two explanations of this case. Some say that the kernels of wheat had taken root after last year's Omer offering was brought, and therefore that offering did not render them permitted. These kernels were then reaped and replanted, but they had not yet taken root prior to the current Omer offering. This is Rashi and Rambam. According to this explanation, had the grain already been rendered permitted by an Omer offering, it would not revert back to a prohibited state, even if it was replanted in the ground. Meir and Baba Metzia 56b. Others disagree and claim that in such a case there is no question that these kernels will be prohibited, as they were never rooted in the ground at the time of the Omer offering. They therefore explain that the grain took root before the Omer, and one later reaped and sowed it again. The Ravid and the Kesef Mishnah. While the grain was in the ground, but before it had taken root. And this is the dilemma that he raises. What is a halacha in such a case? Is it permitted to take these kernels and eat from them? Is a halacha stated considered like that of kernels cast into a jug? And there's a picture here if you have the Gemara on page 112, and it's a jug from the Talmudic period. The jug, a chadash, was the most widely used storage device in antiquity. It was very similar to another container called a chavit. The most prominent distinction was that a cad had a wider mouth and a more basic design. The main purpose of the jug was the storage of liquids, especially wine, but jugs were so readily available and useful that they were used to store grain as well. I disconnect from the ground, and consequently the sacrifice of the Omer offering renders their consumption permitted, or perhaps he have subordinated them to the ground, in which case the halachic status is that of seeds that did not take root and are therefore prohibited. Rabba Baba Hanan raises another dilemma with regard to grains that were reaped and then sowed again. Does the halacha of exploitation apply to them in the case of a disparity of 1/6 between their sales price and their market value, which would render the exploiter obligated to refund the difference between the purchase price and the market value, or does the halacha of exploitation not apply to them? Since the halachot of exploitation apply only to movable property, not to land, this matter depends on whether these grains are considered like detached movable property or whether they have been subordinated to the land. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If we say that one said, I sowed 6 kaf of grain in the field, and a witness came and said that he sowed only 5 kaf in it, this is difficult, but doesn't Rabba say, with regard to any item that is otherwise subject to the halacha of exploitation, and it is sold by measure, kol davar shivmida b'chula. In a case of one who sells an item by measure, weight or number, and it turns out that the measure, weight or number of the item did not correspond to that stated, even the smallest disparity must be returned, regardless of how long it took for the item to be discovered. For example, if one sold 100 nuts and gave only 99, the sale is valid, and he must give one more. The authorities discuss this halacha at length, including the question of whether the Rambam holds that the sale stands, and the seller must supply the missing units, or whether the entire sale is void. Some claim that both the Rambam and the Ravid concur that if it is possible for the seller to supply the missing units, he must do so, but if he cannot, the transaction is void. If the disparity between the price and the value cannot be returned, e.g. the disparity took place in a sale of land, and there is no adjacent land available, the transaction is void. And that's in the Rambam Sefer Kinyan, Hilchot Mechira 15.1, Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 232.1, and the Be'er Hagwa, the tivat, the hamishpat, and the smar there, or by weight, or by number, even the disparity was less than the measure of exploitation, the transaction is reversed. A disparity of 1/6 between the value of an item and its price constitutes exploitation only in cases where there is room for error in assessing the value of an item. In a case where the sale item is easily quantifiable, any deviation from the designated quantity results in a notification on the transaction, even if the sale item in question is subordinate to the ground. Rather, it is a case where the seller said, "I cast kernels in the field as required." What does that mean? Shedei bo kidva'e la v'chudu. Without quantifying the measure of the kernels that he cast, and witnesses came and said that he did not cast kernels in the field as required. Are they subject to halachic exploitation? As the halachic status of these kernels is like that of kernels cast into a jug, and they are subject to the halachic exploitation, or perhaps the labor subordinated them to the ground, in which case they have the state of land, which is not subject to the halacha of exploitation. Rabbi Barav Hanan raised another dilemma with regard to the grains that were reaped and then sowed again. The halacha is that one does not take oath with regard to claims on land. Consequently, if one admitted to part of a claim with regard to such grain, which generally obligates him in an oath, does he take an oath with regard to the kernels, or does he not take an oath with regard to kernels? Is the halacha status like that of kernels cast into a jug, and they are like movable property, and one takes an oath with regard to them, or perhaps he subordinated them to the ground, and they are like land, and one does not take an oath with regard to them? The Gemara concludes that the dilemma should stand unresolved. Teiku. Rami Bar Hama raises another dilemma with regard to wheat kernels that are found in the dung of cattle, or barley kernels found in the dung of an animal. What is the halacha? The Gemara asks, with regard to what issue it was the dilemma raised. If we say that it was with regard to the capacity to become susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, we already learned this in a Braita. As it is taught, if one found wheat kernels in the dung of cattle or barley kernels in the dung of animals, and they do not become susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, but if you collect them for eating, they do become susceptible to the ritual impurity of food. The Gemara provides another suggestion. Rather, perhaps Rami Bar Hama's dilemma is referring to the use of these kernels for meal offerings. The Gemara rejects this. It is obvious that they may not be used for meal offerings, as it is written with regard to those who offer inferior items to the temple. Present it now unto your governor. Will he be pleased with you and show you favor? Says the Lord of Hosts in Menachot 1:8. Any item that one will not feel comfortable bringing to a governor or local ruler certainly not be brought to the temple. The Gemara explains, no, it is necessary to raise the dilemma in a case where one collects these kernels and sowed them in the ground, and now he wants to bring the meal offerings from them. Was halacha is the reason one may not use them initially. Was halacha is the is the reason that one may not use them initially for meal offerings because they are disgusting, and since he sowed them again and the disgusting quality is left, or perhaps they were initially disqualified because they are considered weakened after having been digested by an animal. And if so, even the grains that have now grown after they were replanted are also weakened, like the kernels that gave rise to them. We will conclude that the dilemma should stand unresolved. Rami Bar Hama raises yet another dilemma. In the case of an elephant that swallowed an Egyptian wicker basket, this type of basket was made from tender palm branches that were chosen for their soft and pliant consistency. Such a basket was fashioned by bending the thin willow branches into a bowl shape. Even after the basket was formed, it was still soft and bendable. Therefore, it is possible for an elephant to swallow it whole without chewing or damaging it, and it could be excreted with its original shape intact. And excreted intact along with its waste was a halacha. The Gemara asks with regard to what matter was this dilemma raised. If we say that the dilemma was raised with regard to a case where the wicker basket was richly impure, and the question is if its rich impurity is nullified by the elephant swallowing it, we already learned in the Mishnah in Canaan 25:9, all vessels descend into their state of rich impurity by means of thought. Although an unfinished vessel cannot become richly impure, if the craftsman decided not to finish it, it immediately assumes the halachic stage of a completed vessel and can become richly impure. But they ascend from the state of ritual impurity only by means of a change resulting from an action. A richly impure vessel, once it undergoes physical change, is no longer richly impure. Therefore, as the wicker basket remained intact without physical change, it is clear that it remains richly impure. The Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to raise the lamb in a place where the elephant has swallowed ends of palm leaves, chutzin, related to the Arabic kahus, meaning the leaf of a palm tree. Its usage was expanded to include loose branches of all sorts of growth, as well as splinters from other kinds of trees. And after the leaves were excreted, one made them into an Egyptian wicker basket. The dilemma is as follows. It is called digestion, and therefore the basket prepared from the leaf is like dung vessels and earth vessels, and they are not susceptible to its impurity. As the Master said, stone vessels and dung vessels and earth vessels are not susceptible to its impurity neither by Torah or Binach law. So that moved on to the next Omer, just to finish the sentence. Thank you for listening, and wish you all the best. Bye.